And now, and I yield my time, and now I will recognize Mr. Moran from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sanders, I want to start with you, and then Mr. Bishop, I'm going to come to you with a couple of questions. Mr. Sanders, in your testimony, you mentioned the need to give states more flexibility under the WIOA youth programs. I also believe this is a very important thing we need to do. In my home state of Texas, as well as in 15 other states, their workforce boards are allowed to use the allotment of WIOA youth program funding to go towards individual training accounts for in-school youth through a waiver from the Department of Labor. I believe it's imperative to set the next generation up for success in our communities. Providing states with more flexibility, as was mentioned with their WIOA youth program funding, would allow states to have more power to invest in youth who face barriers to education, training, and employment. That's why I'm working with the committee currently to ensure that all workforce development boards across the nation have this flexibility as we look to reauthorize WIOA. Can you provide Mr. Sanders more insight into how we can provide additional flexibility in youth training programs so that we maximize our impact on surrounding communities?
Thank you for your question, Representative. Yeah, I think one of the beauties of working with youth is you need more tools in the toolbox. And I think this type of waiver that states use, it gives them the ability to address individuals that may be more rural and don't have access necessarily with their own school to have training. So it gives them the ability to find an alternative provider. I think it will help individuals exit high school and maybe have a plan A and a plan A, not a plan A and a plan B. And I think that's important for our youth that they make the right decision whichever way they go. So I think those waivers would pay off.
Great. And I'll note, I see heads nodding across the panel. Does anybody disagree with setting up these individual training accounts for youth programs and youth training? Sounds like a pretty good idea to me. It lets the local community, and in fact, it lets the youth help determine their future, and I'm a big proponent of that. Mr. Bishop, I want to come back to some things that you mentioned earlier. I hear over and over again, in fact, I heard yesterday from economic development leaders in my home state of Texas, in East Texas, that a number of folks involved in economic development, workforce centers, and others oftentimes do not choose to participate in WIOA programs because of the sheer magnitude of the paperwork and the regulatory burdens, the bureaucratic hurdles that go along with that. I'm curious if you hear the same things, and if so, what steps should we take during this reauthorization process to cut out unnecessary paperwork and reduce the regulatory burdens?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. Thank you. It was interesting to me to hear the questions about military and credit for prior learning and talking about the community colleges, because to me, one of the big weaknesses of the current system is it is not connected to community colleges in most communities. We essentially have the community colleges doing their work, the workforce boards doing their work, and never the two shall meet in most places that I see. Same with economic development as well. You sort of have the three-legged stool of economic development, education, and workforce development. The question is, to what extent are those three legs of the stool actually working together on behalf of businesses and residents of those communities? And I dare say that I think that probably it's not working extremely well in many places, unfortunately. And much of that is because I think, again, thematically, as we've talked about, is that the rules that are in WIOA, especially around Title I, are so strict and so stringent that it makes it nearly impossible for people like Mr. Beasley and others. I mean, you've heard all of the details he's had to weave his way around to try to make things work on behalf of the people he serves. And so, yes, I think you hear all the time. And so what essentially happens in states is you get governors and other state-level officials who the system does not work. And so they're creating their own end arounds. I talk about this in my testimony. I've seen this over and over again. They create their own funding mechanisms to pay for ITAs for youth or tuition for workforce programs. They create their own different separate business boards or councils. And so, yes, what happens is essentially they say, the system doesn't really work, but there's not much I can do about it, so I'm going to create something through economic development that does work.
And just to hit on that point again and to echo, we're looking at the Utah model, and that's a model that seems to be working, but under current WIOA is not something that we can fund. What incentives for innovation, that's a phrase you use in your testimony, should we be looking at to include in the WIOA reauthorization?
Yeah. again, it gets back to the demonstration authority idea, and I do give some more specifics outside of the demonstration authority, but the reason I believe so strongly in the demonstration authority, because in the 1990s, I saw what allowing states to innovate around welfare reform and social assistance programs did, where we ended up with a groundswell coming up to Congress so that by 1996, we had bipartisan federal welfare reform with the Clinton administration and a Republican Congress. And so I believe the same kind of bipartisan approach can occur in workforce development. I don't think we have all the answers for what works community by community. We have a very diverse country. So I think the best thing we could do is allow for demonstration authority to let governors working with their local officials come forward to Congress, to the administration, and say, this is what we would like to try, this is what works for us, and in return, here's the improved performance we will seek as a result of this flexibility. I think it's just a really balanced and important approach.
Thanks to the witnesses, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Mr. Walberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.